Greetings and good wishes from the World Health Organization to all those who are watching this event at the FE Healthcare. I'm Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, a Chief Scientist at the World Health Organization, and I wanted to share with you a few reflections on the lessons that we have learned from the pandemic. Of course, we know that we're still in the midst of the pandemic, we are not out of it yet, and so it's not really the time to look back, but it is still the time to learn some lessons as we go forward, trying to get to the end of this pandemic, and then, of course, looking ahead to prevent future pandemics from occurring. The lessons that have been learned are very many, but I'd like to focus more on the ones that are related with science, research, innovation, R&D, product development, and access to medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics. But before we go into that, I'd like to say, of course, that the COVID pandemic has highlighted the fact that when health is impacted, then everything else suffers. And we have seen from the economic fallout and economic impact of COVID that it's also an interconnected area, and you cannot have a few people or a few communities or a few countries that do well while the rest are suffering, especially when there is something like a global catastrophe. And we know that there are other global challenges ahead of us. The pandemic is one, but there are others like climate change, but also antimicrobial resistance, which will affect the whole world. And therefore, action also needs to be taken at the global level. And this is where you need collaboration, you need coordination, you need solidarity, and you need to act as one world. In terms of the pandemic itself, the science has been at the forefront from the beginning. And because of the tools and technologies that are available to us today, I think we have reacted very differently to this pandemic than we did in the past. So, for example, if you take diagnostics, we had within 48 hours of the whole genome sequence of the virus being put on a public database, GISAID, we had developed the first RT-PCR tests. Our WHO collaborating centers had developed that. We have a network of laboratories. For example, the influenza network of laboratories has been operational for more than 50 years and is a wonderful example of a global collaboration to address a respiratory virus that causes a lot of illness every year and that there is a vaccine for. On vaccines, there was, of course, an unprecedented and extraordinary development of over 250 vaccine candidates around the world. Again, many innovative products being developed in India, which is a matter of great pride. And I think the investments in the R&D field over many decades have really paid off now. For example, the mRNA technology has been in development for over 30 years and so far had not really demonstrated kind of success that we see today in the clinic, but they had been mainly being looked at for applications in cancer, in immunological diseases, as well as as vaccines for other infectious diseases. But now we know the potential of the mRNA technology, and not only is it relatively easier to manufacture than the other types of vaccines, which need a large amount of biosafety, and because you have to culture the virus. In this case, you're not culturing the virus at all. You're just using the genetic signal from the whole genome sequence. And then, of course, the complexity comes in the lipid coating and so on. But again, within a few days of the whole genome sequence being available, there were several vaccines that were already being developed, and the first human clinical trials started within a matter of about 60 to 70 days. Now, of course, we are even more ambitious and we say we can do even better next time. So for the next pandemic, if you are well prepared, you may be able to develop vaccines in even a shorter time frame. But also now we know that for diseases like TB and malaria, where we have not had much success with previous vaccine efforts, that the mRNA platform could potentially give us hope that we may be able to develop. But again, TB and malaria are very different pathogens, very complex immune responses as compared to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, where I think we have been very lucky also that the antigens have been good at provoking a very good immune response. So the science delivered as far as the vaccines are concerned, and today if we look globally, over 3.8 billion doses of vaccines have been administered to people. But this is where the inequity starts becoming very obvious. You have the high income countries where more than 90 doses per 100 population have been administered, compared to the low income countries where less than 2 doses per 100 people have been administered. And the upper middle and lower middle income countries are in between. India, of course, is a vaccine manufacturing powerhouse and has enough capacity to manufacture vaccines for its population, but the population is huge, and therefore it also takes time to scale up. So the distribution and the fair and equitable distribution of vaccines has not been, unfortunately, did not happen. And if the 3.8 billion doses had been distributed in a fairer manner, we may not be seeing the 8,000 to 9,000 deaths a day that we continue to see today due to the pandemic. And over the last several weeks, we have seen many countries across many different regions of the world seeing increasing cases, increasing spikes due to the Delta variant, hospitalizations, as well as health systems being overwhelmed and ultimately leading to more deaths. And all this could have been prevented to some extent if we had by now vaccinated at least 20% of the population of every country. What about on treatments? Well, on treatments, things are still a mixed bag because we still don't have a very effective antiviral oral medicine which can be taken early in the stage of the disease and which prevents people from getting more sick. So that is something that we need more R&D on. We need definitely, again, more private and public collaboration on, and we need to continue to look for those antiviral medicines. Broad spectrum antivirals will help not only for COVID, but could also help for future pandemics. And this is a difficult task because we know that antivirals are quite difficult to develop. What we have seen is that there have been a huge number of clinical trials being done across the world. And this is a good thing, of course, a lot of research, but also resulted in a large number of fragmented, small, inconclusive trials, which often led to more confusion than to actually providing the answers. And I think the solution lies in the large platform trials like the WHO Solidarity Trial, which has over 30 countries and over 500 hospitals, many of them in India, participating, and which was able to test very quickly some of the repurposed drugs that were thought to have some potential for COVID-19, but ultimately proved by the Solidarity Trial not to have any impact on mortality or on the duration of hospitalization. And these were drugs like hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, lopinavir, ritonavir, and interferon beta. We're now launching the second phase, the Solidarity Trial, that's looking more at immunomodulatory drugs for patients who are hospitalized with severe and critical illness. The other example of a successful trial is the UK's recovery trial, which was conducted at the NHS hospitals across the UK. And again, very large trial, over 30,000 patients enrolled. And they were also able to quickly test many different drugs and either prove that the drug is effective or prove that it's not effective, because it's equally important to prove that something does not work so that you do not waste your time and resources on such products. So one of the things that we've seen in the area of therapeutics is that people have used drugs very widely, with drugs which have very limited benefit, which have hardly any evidence of any kind of benefit or efficacy. And also there's been a huge amount of over prescription and over medication, either by people themselves or by doctors also over prescribing medicines for a viral disease. We know that there is no real good antiviral. What we need is good clinical care, good supportive care, oxygen at the time when oxygen is needed, and a few drugs like dexamethasone for those who need oxygen, and now the monoclonal antibodies, which some of them are being shown to have some effect on reducing the severity of illness. So these things need to be tested through clinical trials, and the guidelines need to be updated from time to time. And that's what we've tried to do in WHO, is update the guidelines. We call it living guidelines, so that constantly, as more research comes in, more evidence comes in, we can update the guidelines on different categories of treatments. Looking ahead, I think, again, to strengthen our R&D ecosystem in the country, we need to really look at a few areas, starting with the governance, the systems, and the infrastructure. We need to look at engagement between the different sectors, and let us not forget community engagement, as well as the social sciences, which play an important role. We need to look at how to integrate emerging technologies into this whole ecosystem of R&D. And then we also need to look very carefully at the ethics of what we are doing. So just a few quick examples on each. On the governance, we need to make sure that the policies are drafted in advance, that we're prepared, because once you're in the midst of a crisis, you cannot start drafting policies. It needs to be giving the general guidance, but flexible enough to enable affected communities to retain some ownership of the response. It needs to draw on international expertise, because learnings globally are very, very important, and they need to be taken on board. We need to integrate those interventions into our regular programming so that we are prepared even before a pandemic comes. And an example is the WHO's pandemic influenza preparedness framework, which brought together member states and industry and others to implement a global approach to a potential pandemic with an influenza virus. The second main area, and very important, is engagement and inclusion of social and behavioral sciences. As we strengthen our primary healthcare system, we need to start having that engagement with communities and that two-way dialogue, because that really is at the center of all public health. You cannot have good public health without people being involved themselves. Early detection of disease events can be improved by integrating community event-based surveillance systems, and there are a few of those currently being tested in India. There needs to be much more improved communication flow between the public health system and the community. And again, it needs to be two ways. We need to engage the community, address their concerns and questions, and at the same time, continuously provide updated information in a very transparent and open way. We need an inclusive whole of government and whole of society approach to dealing with these kind of crises, which affects everybody. We need to understand the operational context amongst affected communities. A tribal remote community can be very different from an urban slum. So our interventions need to be contextual. And very importantly, I think we tend to neglect the social sciences. We need to make sure that the behavioral insights are incorporated. And then, of course, smart data capture, flexible management information systems using mobile phones. We can now do surveys and surveillance in smart ways that were not possible earlier. We need to invest in R&D. It's very clear that countries that invested in science, invested in research, have an edge always when it comes to not only pandemics, but other health diseases and conditions as well. So we need to prioritize, again, the investments in R&D, both in the academic and in the private sector, but also have mechanisms for collaboration. We need to have clinical trial sites which are already set up and ready to run. We need ethics committees which are really functioning, the way that they should be functioning, and providing oversight to the clinical research and studies. And again, the ICMR has provided a lot of guidance on how ethics reviews should be done. But this is an area which constantly needs also improvement. And then, of course, you need the data systems, you need the regulatory system that is there to support this type of rapid conduct of clinical trials, particularly in emergencies. You need the regulatory system to be flexible, but at the same time, they need to have a core set of principles and rules which they fall back on and which is not compromised. And I think making ethical research a part of normal clinical practice, I think, is going to be very important. Every hospital, every medical school must have research integrated into the clinical practice, because that's the only way in to improve also the clinical care and practice, and to learn about the diseases that one is dealing with. The WHO did put out quite a lot of guidance on various ethical issues during the pandemic, including on things like human challenge studies. We put out on ethical considerations for the COVID contact tracing applications, on mandatory vaccination. So many of the very topical issues, our ethics expert group has made very good position papers for people to really think about the ethical issues that are involved, particularly at a time when things are being rolled out very rapidly. And finally, I would say that we also recently, just a few weeks ago, published a document on a framework for the ethics and governance of artificial intelligence in health. It looks at many of the issues that we just talked about. It is based on the principles of protecting human autonomy, promoting human well-being, safety and public interest, ensuring transparency, fostering responsibility and accountability, ensuring inclusiveness and equity, and promoting artificial intelligence that is responsive and sustainable. And this guidance actually has checklists that are meant for the developers of technology, the AI companies. It's meant also a checklist for ministries of health that are going to regulate the use of such technologies for health applications. And it has a checklist also for the users, that is the doctors and the healthcare facilities where AI-based technologies are actually used in clinical practice. So it's a very pragmatic approach that has been taken, but more and more, I think countries are going to have to grapple with how data is collected, shared, used, and how public, the data from the public can be used actually to improve the health and well-being of the public. So I would like to end there, because I have touched on a number of different issues. And as I said, we've learned many things from this pandemic, which are going to be useful for us to prepare for the next one, but also to strengthen our health system and to make sure that we do better in providing the day-to-day care, both in terms of preventing diseases. Whenever we can, it's better to prevent and promote good health. But of course, once people get sick, then you have to make sure that they are diagnosed and managed appropriately. So thank you very much again for this opportunity. Thank you.